Good Monday morning. What is the last hard thing God's asked you to do? Has He asked you to give something you didn't want to give, or receive something that was hard to receive? Has He asked you to leave a relationship that you don't want to let go of, or have a relationship with someone that may not be someone you want to? Take a step of faith that feels really hard. There's a story in 1 Samuel, where Saul, whom Israel has chosen to be king. Not that God had planned for them to ever have a king, but people have a way of getting in situations that make them afraid, and they will just kind of think they can figure it out themselves and make a much better decision than God. So the people freaked out, and Saul is what they got. So the Amalekites had kind of tormented the children of Israel for years. Even right after they fled Egypt and crossed the Jordan onto dry ground, the Red Sea on dry ground, the Amalekites were immediately there to start harassing and tormenting them, and even killed many of them. But they preyed on the weak, which was very interesting. They got the people in the very back who were weaker than them, and that's who they preyed on. So here comes King Saul, and God gives King Saul a mandate. And he says this, he says, I want you to go and I want you to destroy every little piece of the Amalekites. Their men, their women, their children, even their livestock. I want everything about them destroyed. Now, that's not the first and only time God ever talks about that in Scripture. And I don't know about you, but when I read that, I'm like, Lord, that is harsh. Destroy everything? But then I go back to Isaiah 11, which says God's thoughts aren't my thoughts and His ways aren't my ways. And I also go to the fact that the main attribute of God is His sovereignty, and that He can see things 20,000 with the 20,000-foot view and hundreds and thousands of yards down the way when we're only looking at what's right here. And what God knew was this, that if they weren't utterly and completely destroyed, they would still continue, because their hearts were exceptionally wicked, that they would continue to torment the Israelites and be a snare to them for years to come. So that was why He gave this command. But Saul, this king the people had chosen, didn't obey. Instead, he kept the king and livestock that he thought might be good. And so they're about to sacrifice some of the livestock that they kept when the prophet Samuel comes up and says these words to them from chapter 15, verses 22 and 23. He says, does Adonai take as much pleasure in burnt offerings and sacrifices? Surely obeying is better than sacrifice, and heeding orders than the fat of rams. But rebellion is like the sin of sorcery, stubbornness like the crime of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of Adonai, He too has rejected you as king. So here Saul was being completely disobedient to God, and now his whole kingship has been rejected by God. It's the difference between obedience and disobedience. See, obedience shows and reveals love. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. It also reveals faith, because Scripture clearly says without faith it is impossible to please God. But often you and I, it's easier to give sacrifices than to obey. So we'll pay our tithe, because that feels like a sacrifice, to compensate for our disobedience in another area. Or we'll go and serve underprivileged people because it feels like we're sacrificing something and because we're trying to compensate for our lack of obedience. But we need to realize that disobedience shows rebellion and stubbornness. And the danger in willful disobedience is that we hinder our authority. See, Luke 6:46 says, "Why do you call me Lord and you don't do what I say?" When you and I operate in willful disobedience to the things that God has told us to do, then we really need to go back and ask ourselves, have I really completely, totally surrendered my heart to Jesus Christ? We may not want what God is asking us to do, but what we may be forfeiting is the protection that he sees that we need to be protected from down the road, just like he wanted to protect Israel from the Amalekites. But do you know what? They tortured them and tormented them for years down the road because Saul did not do what God had asked him to do. May what God asks us to do be hard? Yes. But my friends, the consequences to disobedience will be much harder. So do not forget, God always desires obedience more than our sacrifice. If your heart was encouraged today, please know that we have many other resources available for you. You can discover all of those at reclaiminghearts.org.